Good afternoon, everybody, and let me first of all thank you for being with us today, for accepting our invitation. I would like to give a special thanks in particular to our panelists. I will present them shortly. I am the Executive Vice President of the Institute of International Affairs. My name is Ettore Greco. I am also the head of its program on multilateralism and global governance. It is my pleasure to chair this meeting, which is the third we have organized in the last few months in the context of a project on the role of G20 in promoting new forms and instruments of global governance. We have been conducting this project with the support and in cooperation also with the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation and the Compagnia di Sanpaolo of Turin, which is one of our main strategic partners. The overall goal of this project is to identify and discuss the main challenges and opportunities of the Italian presidency of the G20 in 2021, taking into account, of course, the development of the G20 agenda over the years. So also wish to thank in particular our two partners, the Compagnia di Sanpaolo and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for not only their support, but also their precious advice and help in organizing this series of meetings. In accordance with our partners, we have chosen 4 specific subject of the G20 agenda that we expect to figure prominently also in the agenda of the Italian presidency. This afternoon in particular, we would like to discuss the issue of aging, which, as you know, has a great relevance for the future of our economies, the prospect of making national social contracts more robust and resilient, the sustainability of the welfare systems, and all issues associated with the intergenerational equality. The problem of aging has indeed, I would say, become an increasingly global one. This is why I think it has gained some topicality within the G20 agenda. But of course, this problem is affecting the various areas and countries in quite different forms and to quite different degrees. It goes without saying that we cannot ignore these big differences, the differences in the way this trend manifests itself in individual regions and countries. But still, this is a trend that has global implications, and we are interested in discussing how it is progressing, what type of forms it is assuming, and of course its implication in particular for the post-COVID recovery plans in the light of the impact of the COVID-19 epidemic, which, as we know, has put under stress even more deeply our welfare systems, also deepened some forms of inequality, and more generally exacerbate the problem of the financial sustainability of many economies. But we would like also to look into the steps that the G20 could take to stimulate and foster a collective, possibly a coordinated response to this challenge. All these issues, including the potential role of G20 during the Italian presidency, are examined in depth by one of today's panelists, Paola Subacchi, professor at the Global Policy Institute of the Queen Mary University in London, in a paper that she wrote for our project, which will be published early next month. Professor Subacchi will present today the main argument of her paper. This will be, I think, the best way to kick off our discussion. We have also the privilege to have with us other three leading experts, which also have kindly accepted to serve as panelists. Let me present them. Caterina Lima de Miranda, postdoc researcher at the Kiel Institute of the World Economy, one of the leading institute working on economic problems in Europe and worldwide. Guven Sak, director of TEPAV in Istanbul. TEPAV is one of the leading research centers in Turkey. It works in particular on economic problems and global economic problems. And last but not least, Stefano Scarpetta, director for employment, labor and social affairs at the OECD in Paris. After their presentation, the full panelists I will open up and hope there will be enough time for a stimulating Q&A. The meeting will be concluded by Piercarlo Paduan, Vice President of IAI, a former Minister of Economy. But let me now give the floor for his welcome address to Nicola Russo Perez, Director of the Governance and International Affairs Program at the Compagnia di Sanpaolo, which, as I just said, is one of our main strategic partners, our institute that has been in particular a partner for this endeavor. Nicolò, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Ettore, and good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to all the participants and panelists. I'm Nicola Russo Perez, and I have the pleasure of representing the Fondazione Compagnia di Sanpaolo in today's event. First of all, I would like also to thank the organizer, thanks to the Istituto Affari Internazionali, a long-term strategic partner of the Compagnia di Sanpaolo, and thanks also to the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. I would like to, first of all, stress the importance of the strategic partnership between the IAI and the Compagnia di Sanpaolo, because I think it really allows to cover a number of different fields of work of the IAI on a long-term basis, not only on a project-based approach. And I would like also to stress the importance of having developed this partnership in the form of a public-private partnership with also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Italy. This cooperation between the Compagnia, the IAI, and the Ministry is extremely timely. Italy, in fact, will host the G20 in 2021, next year. Therefore, I think there is a huge opportunity for think tanks, for civil society organization, and for the broader scientific and academic community to, let's say, to contribute to the design of the G20 agenda. Think tanks, given their policy-oriented approach, I think are particularly well suited to play a key role in this process, informing the debate and the policymakers, and thus promoting the adoption of more informed and, at the end of the day, more advanced public policies. Just a couple of words on the topic that will be addressed today. The challenges of aging society have been investigated and framed by international organizations since at least the 80s. Aging, in fact, affects productivity and health-related expenditure. The world is experiencing a dramatic demographic transformations. We see Europe and North America and Eastern and Southern Asia with a mature population with a great share of over 60s. Meanwhile, Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, and the Middle East, so the broader MENA region, have a large share of young people. This evolution is part of a very long-term development called the demographic transition, which leads from a regime of high mortality and high fertility to one with low mortality and low fertility. So as the large generation born during the time of high fertility are living longer and the subsequent generation born at the time of fertility decline are smaller, the population as a whole is aging. As a matter of fact, all countries experience this process sooner or later. G20 countries, and here I will conclude my opening remarks, are being increasingly exposed to the effects of population aging, such as having an older and shrinking labor force with more and more retirees. Aging population are threatening the sustainability of fiscal institutions, including conventional tax design, but also pension schemes, healthcare, with far-reaching effects, including rising inequality among generation and migrations. This world reality does require timely, coordinated, and multilateral structural reforms. So I would like to thank again all of you for joining us today. I wish you all a very fruitful conversation. Thanks a lot. Thanks.
So many thanks, Nicolò. I have now the pleasure to give the floor to our panelists. I would like to ask all of them to stay within the time limit of maximum 10 minutes, some more minutes for perhaps Professor Subacchi. And the first is Professor Subacchi. Paola, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ettore, and thank you, Nicolò, Fabrizio, all fellow panelists, and also the participants, because I can see there is a quite large group of participants in this seminar. So I'm delighted to be here to discuss a fundamental problem, a fundamental structural problem, of which we know basically a lot of things, because these are long-term trends, and we can easily and quite easily, I would say, predict. And the question, therefore, is a question of public policy. So the world is aging. What I'm going to do today, in my presentation, I will set the frame of the problem, and then I will go to the conclusion of my paper, and I will briefly suggest or list my recommendations and leave the discussion to the panelists, because I understand the paper has been read. So to frame the problems, say the world is aging, and just to give you a few numbers, about 40% of the global population are now 60 and plus year old. And this is historically something which never happened. And it doesn't happen in society where there is still a traditional demographic profile. So normally the elderly has always been no more than 5% of any population. So this is already incredibly new and unusual for all our history. If we break down this number geographically, and I read my screen here if you don't mind, in Europe and North America, we have already reached 25% of the population age 60 and over. So that means a quarter of our population is so-called elderly. So we are in a demographically mature society, and same for Asia. So sorry, for North America and Europe, if we look at the population of the under 15, so the children, so they are now about 17%. In Asia, these two groups are more balanced. So we got about 17% of the over 60 and about 19% of the under 15. But again, the over 60s is actually growing in Asia. And then we have the MENA, the Middle East and North Africa, where we still see a traditional demographic profile. We, again, less than 5% elderly and about more than 40% of younger people. So this is due to the demographic transition, and very briefly, we define this demographic transition as changes in both mortality and life expectancy. So we tend to live longer and much longer than any of our predecessors. And these changes in mortalities are together with changes in fertility. So we tend to have fewer children. And so the result, you can see it, is an imbalance in the group of elderly vis-a-vis the younger one. So we have a stronger, in the last particularly 50 years, we have seen a strong expansion in the older group vis-a-vis the younger one. The good news, and I stress this is the good news because sometimes when we talk about aging, we have this sort of, it looks like it is a huge problem. Actually, it's a great news. It's a great news because we live longer and we tend to live longer and in better health, again, compared to any other of our predecessors. Again, changes in mortality are critical in this living longer and in better health. And we have two sets of changes in mortality. One is the early life. So again, until very recently, child mortality was quite significant, and it's still significant in poor countries. And then changes in mortality also in later life. And so we have seen a changes in what we call technically life expectancy at birth. So basically how many years a person who's born today is expecting to live. And so today, a baby born in 2020, hopefully doesn't get the COVID, but in 2020, ceteris paribus, he or she is supposed to live on average globally up to 79. Yeah, and that was 65 in mid-1950s. So again, these are global numbers. If we look at life expectancy at 60, so somebody who is today 60, how long he or she is expecting to live, average is 81. So again, it's something that our predecessor considered very old age. What is very interesting, and this is the policies challenge, is that between 1950 and 2020, the number of the over 60s have more than tripled in the developed world. And the more interesting point, and I think to me is the changing in the game, is really the big transformation and the big challenge, is the group of the over 90, is what I call the super old. Again, a group of people that almost didn't exist before. They were really very tiny this way. But now we have in the world, there are, sorry, in the developed world, there are almost 12.5 million people aged over 90. And in 1950, there were just 700,000. So again, it's a large group and it's due to grow because again, even in our anecdotal experience, we can now name and remember more than one person who is aged over 90. So what this is really is, first of all, the group of elderly then traditionally was classified as just the over 60. And if you look at many statistical offices, they tend to overlook to get this group of people all together. That is a big mistake. It's no longer pliable because one thing is to be age 60 to 80. Again, even from a medical point of view, people tend to live in more or less a healthy life. And then it's over 80 where really big medical conditions start to kick in. And so I think we need at the very least divide this group, this population group into a very detailed age group by 5 years or 10 years group in order to have a more detailed and a more accurate picture. So that is the situation. We're going to be more. There will be more people living on our planet, and there will be, according to the UN prediction, by 2050 there will be over 2 billion people aged 60 and over, and 1 in 5 people in developing countries, not developed. So that means the developing countries are fast catching up with the developed world, where I stress again, 25% of the population is over 60. So 1 in 5 people in developing countries will be over 60 by 2050. If we go down to, if you boil down this data on the G20, and again, we got a quite mixed group because we got developed countries, which are already the over 60 are already well above the 20% of the population, with Japan and Italy being actually the countries with a very large group of elderly. But then we see the developing countries within the G20 with a growing group already between 10 and 20 and growing. And then we have, I would say, the more traditional countries with actually still a more traditional demographic profile. So these are the characteristics. So we're going to have more and more people over 60, so even more and more over 90s. So what do? This is a policy problem. It's a policy problem then, until very recently, has been treated as a domestic problem with domestic solution. And so it has never really got on an international agenda. In fact, if you look at the G20, the responses have been so far patchy. And it's more like first year we saw aging as a priority in the G20, on the G20 agenda, was actually in Japan last year for obvious reasons. But among the challenges and the priorities for the Osaka Summit 2019, aging, the problems related to an aging society rank as a 6th priority out of 7. The UN has done quite a lot of work around the aging, but again, in a sort of fragmented way, and mostly looking at the issue of healthy aging, and that's exactly what the G20 put in the Osaka Leaders Declaration. So the focus is very much on healthy aging, inclusive aging, policies to address the dementia. So very much the medical aspects of aging, and that's partly due to the inputs given by the WHO to the Osaka Summit, to the G20 last year. Another aspect which was developed in particular by the OECD and the GPFI was that of financial inclusion. So again, aging, how to make sure then we make sure then the aging equal retirement from work remains, people remain, they continue to be sustainable, have a financially sustainable life, and they are also financially included, so they have access to all sorts of financial instruments that allows them to look after themselves properly. But I think we need a fresh view on aging, and that's what I would like to see with the Italian presidency next year, partly because Italy has already moved into the group of, is not quite it has not completed his demographic transition like Japan, but is very close. So it is an issue for Italy. So I like to see aging on the agenda of the G20, but in a sort of fresh and new way. And my first recommendation for the Italian presidency would be to establish a working group on aging. Aging is a transnational, if you like, is a domestic, but also has very important implication for the rest of the world. And in particular, I'm thinking just the most important issue is the monetary policy and the impact the monetary policy has on pension sustainability. So again, low for longer, to quote the IMF annual report of October 2019. So again, there are aspects of aging that are not only domestic, and there are all aspects related to fiscal sustainability. So having a working group on aging where countries can exchange good practice, where countries that are already ahead in their demographic transition can help those behind to move and to manage this demographic transition. It would be very, very useful. And I got a list of recommendations of what I would like to see this working group working on. And so first of all, as I said before, I would like to see improvements in data collection and better definitions of aging. How do we define aging? Who is an elderly person? At which level we start to discuss, and which are the differences between different age groups inside this box of elderly. And we need data collection that are internationally comparable. And so we need more details as well. As I said before, just having a big box of the over 60, of the over 65 is not enough. We need to rethink the economic contribution of active retirees, and I will go back to this point in our discussion. These are just my sort of laundry list. I like to consider the distributional effect of the reform of pension system, which has been undertaken by a number of G20 countries over various years. And I like to see, in order to, in particular, to prevent old age poverty. And this is, we know, is a problem for developed countries, not only for developing countries or low-income countries. The fourth point is to preserve, to have this working group focusing on intergenerational equity. So again, the relations between the over 60 and the younger one. And there are a huge amount of intergenerational equity that need to be addressed. And linked to this point, I like the working group to take a long-term view on the impact of aging on fiscal sustainability, and link this discussion to income and wealth inequalities. And finally, I like to consider the impact of historically low interest rates on pension system sustainability. Again, lower for longer, as I mentioned before. So this is very much my shopping list, and I think the bottom line is we need to reconsider aging in a very fresh way, in a very integrated way, and from a macroeconomic point of view, in a way then pulls together monetary policy and fiscal policy, and in policy then address income and wealth inequality. And we stop here. Thank you.
Many thanks, Paola, for setting the stage so brilliantly. You offer indeed many insights and also discuss the main feature of the aging trends and also offering what you term the shopping list, which was indeed very interesting because we are, as I said, trying to identify recommendations and specific policy proposals for our presidency. So this part was, in my view, particularly important. So that I like now to give the floor to Dr. Catarina Lima de Miranda, postdoc researcher at the Keele Institute for the World Economy. Catarina, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining this webinar on the challenges of aging society and the role of the G20. And thank you, Paola, for setting the stage. I think, yeah, it's a very important issue, and we've heard quite interesting numbers, and I think we are all aware of how demographic change is coming along, but I still find it very impressive how the figures are evolving. I see demographic change in aging society as mainly cross-sectional issue, so poses challenges and opportunities in all areas where, for example, the G20 is working on. And so I think this issue needs to be addressed from very different angles and domain. And so besides the challenges posed on the economic system due to demographic change, I would like to talk about the great challenges in the social domain that are coming along with demographic change, but how these affect our society in general. So some questions are, how can we integrate an increasingly older population instead of disintegrating them in order to prevent an age divided society? And I agree with Paola that there is a need to differentiate more within the age group. So above 65, we have a very heterogeneous group of people. And what I would like to do is to share with you a new approach to measuring well-being beyond GDP. And I would like to give you a rather general idea of this, we call it the SAGE approach to measuring well-being, and the notion behind it. And then I will try to relate it to the topic of this webinar and argue why I believe that coping with the challenges of aging societies involves taking a broader approach to measuring well-being than GDP. So this is a project, a joint project with Dennis Noah and in relation to the Global Solutions Initiative. And the motivation of this project, which is embedded into this Global Solutions Initiative, is to contribute to the recoupling of economic and social prosperity. So why recoupling? Well, we believe that the fundamental challenge of our age lies in the fact that the global economy is largely integrated, but global societies and polities remain fragmented. And we can also see this in age divisions in societies. So over the last 4 decades, globalization and technological advance have generated significant growth of GDP, as we all know, but this growth has been accompanied, for example, by rising inequality, climate change, and rising sense of individual disempowerment. And the persistence of national, ethnic, and religious conflicts around the world, combined with rising dissatisfaction among large population groups that feel left behind, both in the developed and in developing countries, attest to such decoupling for significant segments of modern societies. And this includes what we could call an age divide and the way how older persons are viewed and treated in our economies. So what we see is that in many countries around the world, economic prosperity, environmental performance, and social prosperity are no longer aligned, they are decoupled. So if we want to tackle these challenges, we will need to confront the paradox of growing economic activity in an integrated global economy, accompanied by ongoing tensions arising from fragmented societies. And the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated in a dramatic way how interconnected we are and how dependent we are on each other, but how hard it is to really work together. And I think the G20 plays a very important role in order to reshape our government policies and businesses' decisions in order to promote the necessary changes towards more resilient and environmentally friendly direction, to promote social prosperity in inclusive societies, and this means including all societal groups. Now, in order to guide this process, we need well-being measures that go beyond GDP and shareholder value. And why is that so? Well, since people have both economic and social goals, human well-being depends on both economic and social prosperity. And because these two are distinct from each other, we are convinced that social prosperity must be measured in terms of social variables that are distinct from goods and services. And the underlying insight is that humans have several fundamental needs and purposes, each of which must be satisfied in order to generate human well-being. So only when people's material needs have been met, when they feel securely and meaningfully embedded in society, when they have the power to influence their circumstances in accordance with self-determined goals, and when they live respectfully of planetary boundaries, then they achieve a wider sense of human well-being. And failure to achieve any of these ends is associated with suffering. Now we can see that for the elder population, that it becomes more and more difficult to feel meaningfully embedded in society. In many of European countries, for example, we see, for example, that over 30% of over 65-year-olds in Europe live alone. So there we already see that it becomes harder for social embeddedness, and also the power to influence their own circumstances decreases with age. Now, Our SAGE approach aims to capture this multiplicity of goals in form of a dashboard. And what we propose, and we have done this also within this year's G20 context, is the Recoupling Dashboard as a new theoretical and empirical basis for assessing well-being beyond GDP. And it introduces these aspects by in particular introducing two new indexes, agency and solidarity, which should be examined alongside economic prosperity and environmental sustainability. So we call it the Recoupling Dashboard, and it consists of 4 indexes, and we call it the SAGE approach, where S stands for solidarity and covers the needs of humans as social creatures living in societies that generate a sense of social belonging. A stands for agency and involves empowerment, so it covers people's need to influence their fate through their own efforts. G stands for material gain and may be represented by GDP per capita, for example, though the inadequacies of these index are well known. And E stands for environmental sustainability, which may be measured by the Environmental Performance Index. And I think if we think about demographic change, all of these 4 areas are affected by demographic change. So again, I see this as a cross-cutting issue. Now, these 4 indexes are meant to embody a SAGE approach to assessing human well-being, intuitively connecting to fundamental needs and purposes. And because these 4 goals are not consistently substitutable for one another, our measures, our index is supposed to be should be understood as a dashboard. In our so we have a theoretical foundation, and we also gathered some data for the last decades for more than 30 countries, covering almost all G20 countries. And what we can see is that actually the development of GDP per capita differs quite substantially from solidarity and agency. And the upshot is that there is an increasingly integrated global economy, but persistently fragmented global societies and polities, which cannot be measured simply by GDP. Now, I think the COVID-19 pandemic, in a way, is a good example how largely agency and solidarity affect well-being, because the policy measures as responses to the pandemic has affected agency, for example, the restrictions to move freely, or solidarity because personal contact became more difficult due to social distancing measures. And the older population has seen a disproportionately negative impact on their right to health and other human rights. So in most countries around the world, older persons have been asked to self-isolate earlier in the general population, and the confinement is lasting longer. And this puts an additional stress on social solidarity in our society and the integration of the elderly. In the context of the G20, what we would propose is that fundamental human needs need to be put at the core of its policies, including all parts of the societies, and demographic change will particularly put stress on solidarity, social solidarity, and also on agency of an aging society. One way in order to put these needs at the core of policies is, of course, using other measures that we want to maximize instead of just GDP growth. So one way could be to integrate the SAGE framework as a useful tool to have a balanced assessment of human well-being, and to examine, for example, the performance of different countries, and in particular the performance when it comes to policies that rearrange or that adapt our systems to an aging society. Thank you.
So many thanks, Katarina. I think you also have contributed to making the picture even more complex and articulated by, in particular, shedding some light on paradoxical dilemmas those you mentioned. In particular, I think this notion of decoupling is certainly worth discussing. There is obviously the need to try to align better the capacity to create new forms of social solidarity with the global trends to cope more effectively with the implication of those global trends, which are one can add even they are now under threat in a sense. So we have a picture which is even more problematic in terms of globalization, because we are now also witnessing factors that are putting into doubt some global interlinkages, and this also create additional problems. But I think you are inviting us to look also into the social dimension, which is absolutely crucial. And of course, I think the aging problem is, in a sense, at crossroads of social economic problems. So it's very important problem also in this regard. And now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Guven Sak, Director of TEPAV in Istanbul. Please, you have the floor.
Okay, let me start by saying that, it's a very good decision to focus on the issue of demographic transition, because what we have here is a global megatrend that needs to be addressed. And there are two data points that are important. One is this rising life expectancy, and the other is declining fertility rate of women, and it's happening everywhere. And I agree with Paola when she said that there is the need to focus more closely and collect some data, work on the definitions, because this is an issue that we are going to face in all the G20 countries, not only in developed countries, but also in developing countries too. It's already started happening in Turkey. For example, if you look at the fertility rate has declined to 188 last year. So it's now below the replacement ratio. And if you look at the change in population, the increase in the number of more than 64 in Turkey is so much higher than the increase in the number of less than 5 years old in the country. It has already started. So I think this is an issue that needs to be addressed. And I agree that, it's bringing all those problems with the decline in the working age population. But there is the need, I think there is some kind of a refinement is needed, because there are also macro impacts that are happening in the transition period too. Because, the share of 64 is not increasing by itself magically. First, the number of, the one above 50 increases, 45 increases. So the people start to accumulate savings for their old age. And that led to also some macroeconomic impacts with lower interest rates. And that also bad for the intergenerational equity issues too. So it is an issue that needs to be analyzed more thoroughly in terms of not by looking at the impact at the very end, but the whole transition period also needs to be analyzed. And that's what I was surprised to see in Japan, because I started participating in these debates starting from the Japan year in G20. And that's what I was surprised, because there wasn't any detailed studies on the transition period to aging population, when it's not only about when the number of above 64, 65 increase to 20, 25% or 30%, but this whole process is all impact in terms of growth and savings on interest rate impact needs to be analyzed, I think, along the way. So I think that's a missing element in the discussion. And again, when compared to the situation when we were in Japan, in the Japan year, you know, we don't have COVID-19. COVID-19 also is like a spoiler that needs to be taken into account in all the debates that we already had in the negative impact of the aging population, I think, and that needs to be considered, because when you look at the impact of COVID-19 now, if this thing is going to stay with us, this pandemic is going to stay with us for a couple of years, then the corporate sector needs to make more adjustments along the way. There is the need for more investments, and all those investments for fostering digitalization, fostering remote work in all our economies, I think, is only going to exacerbate the possible negative impact of negative economic cost of the aging population also. So I think we need to take into account how to deal with the pandemic also into this question too, because COVID-19 has shown all the vulnerabilities that we had, starting from elderly care centers, about their governance problems. And also, I think it also had shown the importance of remote healthcare facilities, you know, in terms of when discussing these longevity issues. The issue is also about providing a kind of a more healthy and also environment by increasing the well-being of the elderly. But when we look at the situation now, I think there is also an additional element with this remote health services revolution that's happening. There are new elements that needs to be taken into account, I think, regarding the discussion of the aging population. So let me stop here. I tried to be very brief about what I had in mind regarding Paolo's presentation.
Many thanks. I think you also have clearly invited us to take into account other missing elements. And I think you have also clarified again that we indeed need to expand this debate, which seems to be at the early stage still, even at the level of G20. So now my pleasure to give the floor to Stefano Scarpetta, Director for Employment, Labor and Social Affairs at the OECD. Please you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It is really a great pleasure for me to participate in this discussion. I think that Paolo Subacchi provided really an excellent overview of the demographic challenges at the global level, and the key issues that potentially the G20 under the Italian president can take on. I think she listed a number of policy recommendations, but I think an important point that she underlined, which I fully agree with, is also the need really to have a whole of government approach. This really requires a discussion at all levels involving policymakers, both on the macro side as well on the structural side. The second general observation I'd like to share is also a point that Goldman Sachs was just mentioned in his intervention. This is about the need to consider the very rapid and deep demographic changes in conjunction with the other key mega trends which are shaping and reshaping our economies and our society. And here I refer certainly to the digital transformation, but also to the greater integration along the global supply chain. Because I think these mega trends, the demographic changes as well as the others, are really interacting with one another very closely. And if we just focus on the challenges of one of the mega trends without taking into account these interactions and possible synergies, I think we might not deliver the adequate policies. Now, I think the data are there. Even if we focus on the G20 countries, obvious that there is a significant trend towards very rapid aging of the population. Another statistics that the median age for the advanced G20 countries is already above 40 and is set to increase very rapidly by 2050. But even in a number of the G20 emerging economies, yes, the average age, the median age is below 30, but some of them are aging very rapidly, actually even more rapidly than many of the advanced G20 economies. The other important point to set our discussion is that one of the main reasons behind these demographic changes is not only the low fertility rate, but actually is the significant improvement in life expectancy. Paola indeed referred to that. And that's, I think, is an important point because it's one of the major achievements, not only in the advanced, but actually in all the other G20 countries. The additional element of that is that not only life expectancy is rising pretty rapid, but actually that the number of years of healthier life is also increasing. In fact, when we look at the increase in life expectancy in most of the G20 countries, most of the years are years of healthy life. So not only we are living longer, but also we are living longer in good health, which of course has a number of implications for the ability of an individual to continue to participate more actively into our society, into our economy. The other important caveat to that, though, is that with the increase in life expectancy and with the increase in years of life in good health, we also see increasing inequalities. So not everyone is living longer. And in particular, I would say not everyone is living longer in good health. So together with the increase in longevity, we also see increase in inequality in health outcome across the life of an individual, but in particular at old age. Now, already in 2015, under the Turkish presidency in Ankara, the G20 set up, actually there was a strong impetus put by the Italian government there, the key principles on the silver economy on active aging. And in fact, these G20 principles focus a lot on the enormous opportunities that the silver economy, if you like, opens up. People are staying in work longer and remain socially active longer. And this, of course, is also associated with the changes in demand for new goods and services that respond to the needs of older people. So we have to really try to capture and grasp these opportunities. Of course, there are also a number of challenges. And what I'd like to share with you is some observation with a focus more specifically on the labor market and the social policy spheres. One information is not only to look at the dependency rate, the usual way in which we do that, that is to look at the share of individuals 65 and over the working age population, but actually looking at the economic dependency. So here at OECD, we have calculated for all the G20 countries, actually for all of the OECD countries, how many individuals there are 50 plus who either are inactive or are unemployed over the labor force. So those actually who are in the labor market and working. And this number, of course, are much higher than of course, the normal dependency rate. But if we project the same participation rate going forward, in a country like Italy, by 2050, there will be more people inactive, 50 and plus inactive, over the workers. So more people, 50 plus, who are either inactive or unemployed compared to those who are unemployed. Of course, if we take into account some of the recent trend in participation by women, and if we take into account also the increasing participation of all the workers, possibly this economic dependency will be lower, but there are certainly major challenges. Now, when we focus on the labor market and social policy, I think for a long time, for very good reasons, a lot of the focus was on the supply side. So basically how to encourage all the people to stay longer in the labor market, also strengthen the financial sustainability of the pension system. I said this was very important because many pension systems were already strained and potentially would have been not sustainable going forward. But also, thanks to this reform, we have seen an increased participation of all the workers. It's difficult to say what is going to happen with the current COVID crisis, but certainly after the global financial crisis, we have seen participation rate of all the workers not declining and actually continue to increase even during the, if you like, the first years in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. The G20 policy priorities on active aging in employment that, again, as was recalled, were endorsed by the Ministry of Labor and Employment in 2019 under the Japanese presidency, focus a lot on the demand side. And I think would be important for the Italian president to some extent to focus and to go deeper, if you like, on these issues. This is in a crucial area where more progress is needed, and which to some extent requires policies, there is no question about that, but also in my view requires a very close collaboration and cooperation with the private sector, with the companies, and with the key stakeholders, because we have to address deep-rooted discriminatory practices and really encourage an inclusive and age-diverse cultures where actually all workers can feel comfortable and appreciated regardless of their age. Now, age discrimination is still far too common in most of the G20 countries, if not in all countries, although it is banned through laws, of course, in all of the G20, especially the high-income countries. There is still persistent myth whereby older workforce means less productive workforce. And this, of course, has significant implication in the hiring and retention decisions of older workers by many companies. In a report we're actually about to finalize, working together with the World Economic Forum, but also the AARP, this will be launched at the end of the year, we present actually new evidence of the productivity gains that can be accrued with a multi-generational workforce at the company level. The report will also offer an action plan to support global employers to adapt to the new world of work in which there will be more people of prime age and actually older age. And of course, how this phenomenon should take into account the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. The other important point that I would like to share is also that I think we really need to take a life cycle approach to policy making. Sometimes we intervene about the employability of older workers later, when they're already in the advanced age, rather than try to take into account how some of the challenges they might have had during their working life may actually result at a later age in a significant problem of employability, in particular the adaptation and the improvement of their skills, which is of course an important component in a country, in all countries that are facing a significant digital transformation. And this includes taking stronger action to improve the employability of workers throughout their working life, try to detect and understand some of the challenges that people might face because of lack of investment in education, lack of access to training and retraining, and so on and so forth. It's only by this life cycle approach that we can really sort of generate or contribute to build a sort of a workforce, including older workers, that continue to be employable also at a later age. We also need to ensure that the employment policy promote high quality jobs throughout the working life, throughout tighter health and safety standards, well-enforced labor regulation, and of course, effective social protection that covers all workers, depending, also taking into account different type of contract they have. So I think building on the 2019 policy priorities that were set up again in Japan, I think we might want to promote through the G20 Italian presidency a G20 multi-generational policy agenda. Let me just sketch some of the points that I think could be part of this multi-generational policy agenda. One is identifying policy, government institution, and governance tools to harness the complementarity between various ages all along the life cycle and address the risk of rising inequality across generations. Second, identify tools and engaging with companies to help and encourage them to successfully manage multi-generational workforces, as well as to better prepare workers at all ages to manage longer careers in an increasingly digitalized world. And a key focus would be strengthening the health and safety at work in the wake of COVID-19, because these indeed are the short-term challenges we are all facing. I think if we build on what has been done in Ankara 2015 and in 2019, and we take this multi-generational approach, the G20 can indeed make a very important contribution what are global challenges, as well as allow ministers, both ministers of labor, but of course also leaders, to share common practices, good practices, and have this whole of government approach to deal with aging and to exploit as much as possible the opportunities and not just face the challenges, which will be probably there for sure. These are some of the considerations I wanted to share with you, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. I think you raised another quite important set of questions, including in particular the interaction with what you term mega trends. I think the issue of digital transformation, the impact of digital transformation, the interaction between digital transformation and aging is crucial, of course, and also the impact on labor market, the potentiality of the silver economy, and the need also to go beyond just a discussion of the dependency rate to take into account other key parameters, including particular participation rate, which for our country is, of course, very important. What I think has emerged also from your intervention is that there is need, in a sense, to renew the efforts undertaken during the Japanese presidency. Of course, they were still interested in promoting this issue. Probably the current Saudi presidency is relatively less interested, but it's also clear that the OECD making a great contribution, and of course we'll speak, as also Paola did in intervention, about the need to improve our knowledge of data and data elaboration. It's clear the OECD is the key institution. We I think all have in mind the very comprehensive studies regularly published by OECD, particularly on the such problem as aging and also the evolution of labor markets. So many thanks. We have some time for Q&A. To ask a question, you can click the raise your hand button in the participants tab on the right of your screen. Of course, while asking your question, please turn on your microphone. At the end of your question, please turn your microphone off, and I think you need also to lower your hand by clicking on the hand button again. There is also another option I would like to underline. You may also choose to write your question by using the Q&A tab in the chat, in case, for instance, you are unable to use the other option. And please introduce yourself before asking your question. So now the floor is open. Since I don't see any hands raised, I perhaps to break the ice, I'd like to ask Paola, right, Paola, if you have already some reactions to the comments of the other speakers.
Well, my first reaction is to thank the other speaker for their very good comments. I like very much Stefano Scarpetta's multi-generational policy approach, and I think it would be a really very interesting and very beneficial, helpful attempt to really look at some mega trends and not to create again policy boxes, because the risk here is we talk about aging, we forgot about the young people. And we cannot talk about aging without even including, especially if you look into the inequalities, without including young people. So having a multi-generational policy approach is definitely a very good suggestion. And this is something that the Italian presidency could and should embrace, because again, there are issues that are faced by certainly European countries, developed countries, in both, if you like, side of the age distribution. So I think we are all very much on the same page there. I think again, to add to what Stefano said, there is a fundamental inequality in the old age, and it's not only the inequality which comes for people who haven't contributed enough to their pensions, and either because in system like in the UK, basically a private system, so therefore they haven't saved enough, or because they haven't been in employment, in formal employment for long enough. So there are obviously groups of people then are particularly affected and in the old age. And I'm thinking particularly of women. So this is another issue, if you like, another element of this very complicated, very complex puzzle that need to be taken into account. But there is also an aspect on unfairness in the current pension system, which tend to privilege and to reward those who can actually stay longer in full-time employment or even part-time employment to be active in the labor market. And these people are normally those with jobs that allow them to continue to be active. I'm thinking obviously more white collars than blue collars, people with good medical and health conditions. And again, we know now, and we are aware, there's huge amount of data that shows a correlation between medical health conditions and income and education. And so, and also there is an unfair life expectancy that tend to penalize those who cannot go retire, you know, at an age where they still have some time to enjoy their pension. So again, low income, low educated people, disadvantaged people tend to have lower life expectancies than what is called the educated professional middle class. And obviously, by moving forward the age of retirement, which is correct from a fiscal sustainability point of view, it is actually penalizing for some of these people. And so there is an implicit inequality built in the system. So these are some of the issues that should actually be addressed. And so countries that have been and are going through this demographic transition should actually be able to help those which are fast aging, like the emerging market economies part of the G20. But I think again, it's a very, very complex and rich agenda or mega trends. So the challenges that come from this mega trend are such, and then the policy agenda is by definition very large and very complex.
Stefano, please.
No, thank you. And I just want to follow up on Paola, because I've been following the G20 since 2010. So I've been following in particular, of course, the employment and labor track. To be honest and frank with you, there is a risk that given the situation post-COVID or in the COVID crisis, with a very rapid increase in in unemployment in general, but in particular in youth unemployment, there might be a sort of a risk that we now focus on helping young people, which by all means is needed, and where we expect this year, of course, but also next year, the G20 leaders to have very strong and make strong commitment. But the multi-generational approach is again a way not to show that we are supporting one group against another group, but rather that we look at different groups that actually by working together can actually lead to better outcomes, and try to exploit synergies on policies that can help different groups, different age groups and beyond. Now, if you take the multi-generational approach and if you follow what we have been saying today, the demand side is very important. So one element that I already suggest with my colleagues, Italian colleagues, is that we definitely have to try to work closely, the G20 working closely with the B20, so the business 20, because of course, addressing some of the implicit or explicit discrimination against all the workers has to do a lot with what happened in the private sector, what happened in companies, what happened in the labor market from the demand side. So my suggestion would be to try to engage, and the B20 and L20 have been pretty active on these issues, so I'm pretty sure it would be useful and possible to do that. The other, and Paola was referring to that, and again, look at the longevity, but also the increase in inequality. It's not just a question about the pension income because of different contributions. And certainly going forward, we have new generation of people because of the nature of their job are not contributing enough. So there is a risk that within our pension system, we have new generation reaching retirement age with very low contributions. But I think the other important point is actually that not everyone is aging in good health. So since in a number of countries we are raising the retirement age, there are individuals that are perfectly in good health to continue to work longer, but others who are not. So how do we adjust, how do we make pension system taking fully into account the fact that yes, we are living longer, but not everyone is actually living in good health? I think is going to be an issue also in the emerging economies that are aging very rapidly. Again, not everyone is aging in the same with the same level of health. And then the last issue I want to mention is that the G20 reluctantly took on the issue of migration over the past few years. Actually, the OECD is asked to produce a report about migration flows on an annual basis. But of course, when we're talking about demographic changes and demographic imbalances, migration will not be the solution, but certainly can be one of the elements to be taken into account. I think the Italian presence can be very credibly sort of taking or basically raising the profile of the reflection on migration issues by also looking at migration as, again, not the solution by no means, but one of the tools that could be considered also in the fact that there are demographic imbalances across the G20 countries, but for some also more globally. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. First, I'll ask your question and then I will then read the question in the chat. Please. We have two questions in the chat, please.
Yeah, thank you very much to all the speakers for their very, very valuable interventions and contribution to the discussion. I just want to ask to all of you, what we are discussing about something, a multidimensional issue that is aging. And even if it's true what Paola was highlighting, the fact that we are seeing somehow converging trends at the demographic level, it is true that we have different situations between developed countries, developing countries, middle-income countries, advanced countries, and so on and so forth. So what I would ask to you is, in this multi-dimensional issue, what is the dimension that is most promising to find a consensus at the G20 level? I mean, it is the labor market or pensions and the pension systems and the welfare, possibly the health and long-term care, or even the housing issues. I mean, what is the perspective on the on aging that has more possibility to find a consensus at the G20 level? Thanks to all of you again.
Thanks, Fabrizio. As I said, at the moment I have just two other questions in the chat. The first relates to the environmental dimension and the second on gender one. The first question is declining human population is a good news from the point of view of planetary boundaries. So how do you assess the positive environmental effect of aging? Can we take that into account? This is the question which has been raised. And the second relates to gender. It is time to address seriously gender inequalities, especially among old people. The 40% of all people are women, especially single parents, who could not work full-time or committed themselves in working career because of the burden of their families. So unless there are other questions, I'll give now the floor perhaps in the first to Paola. If you have, please, Paola, some brief comments on this set of three questions.
Well, actually, I'm not sure I understand the first question about the, I'll read it again, the one about the declining population, the declining human population. I'm not sure.
So I think
the question is asking.
I think there is a widespread feeling, perhaps, that these aging trends may have a positive impact because of the decline in the population on environmental dynamics.
I don't think we are actually, the human population is not declining. The projection are actually for a very quite steep increase. So I'm really, I think I'm going to pass on this question. Maybe other panelists have, they better than me to understand exactly what the angle of this question. But I take the second one because I'm really, as you know, I'm very fond of this issue, and in particular the engagement group called Women 20. And again, I refer to what Stefano said before. On this issue, the Women 20 should be engaged as much as the B20 with the G20. There is a big issue about women that are not part of the formal labor market, therefore their contributions pension contributions are not accounted for because they don't have contributions. And there is a whole issue about the bringing more women to the labor market. And that is one of the commitments that the G20 committed to in Canberra in 2014, so to increase the participation of women to the labor market by 25% by 2025. This is a very important issue. There is a huge poverty, as I mentioned before. I think we need to do more, and I hope the Italian presidency will do more in terms of try to engage again the Women 20 in some strong policy agenda. As a footnote, when Italy chaired the G7 in 2017, there was this roadmap to gender equality, this document which was approved in Taormina, which was excellent and actually raised all this issue about, again, how to somehow even to measure the impact and the contribution of domestic work to GDP, something that, again, certainly the advanced economies can do, and in order to give a sort of number around particularly the female contributions to family and welfare and well-being. And that document was excellent, and I think it would be an excellent starting point for the discussion around these themes for the G20. And I'll stop here, otherwise I will take too much time.
Caterina, do you want to add?
Yes, maybe very briefly to the first question. I follow Paola. I don't think that we have projections that the world population is actually declining. And then I would also be very, very careful of trying to, so if we think of the 4 indexes or 4 goals that I talked about earlier, we shouldn't try to act one against the other, right? So we need all of them. So we need thriving societies, but they can only thrive if we have environmental sustainability. So thinking along these lines, I think it's very dangerous, and we should try to live in an environmental sustainable way with the people that we have. And I wanted to also say that I think it's very useful to think in this multi-generational framework, because we've seen this year with Saudi Arabia, the focus has been on youth and youth unemployment, and last year in Japan we have seen aging societies. But this is of course a trend within the society, and we need to look at all the different age groups and need to fulfill all their needs, right, of all the age groups. So we should try to think this in a holistic way and try to think about inclusive societies, age-inclusive societies, but also different societal groups. So I think the focus on the active labor market policies that take a life cycle approach are very useful. And if we think about technological advance, there the youth might have an advantage. So we need to strengthen training programs for a digital transformation for the elderly. But then on the other hand side, we also need training programs for the youth. So it's useful to think about all age groups when we think about labor market policies. And finally, just a call. So I think when we talk about aging societies, we shouldn't only think about the labor market, but we really need to take the solidarity aspect into account. So how can we integrate all age groups in a way that they feel embedded in the society, useful to the society, and so that the generation can profit from from each other instead of creating some kind of division between age groups and kind of the fight of the generations, for example. Thank you.
Can I also add something to the discussion?
Yes, sorry.
Let me start with this decline in the population, this environmental impact issue. I think it is, the question I think is related with the new projections, new population projections, because we are usually using the UN projections for all these numbers, but this year in the Lancet there is a new, I think, University of Oxford study. They at the dynamic impact of declining fertility rate for women, especially in the developing countries, into account, and that led to a situation, if you take the long view, 2100, for example, if you take the long view, the population of the world is expected to decline from what it is today. So there is going to be a decline when you look at those projections. And this also has an impact on the situation regarding migration too. If you look at the same figures, that may add a new discussion or a new element into the discussions about the migration issue, because currently when we are discussing about demographic transition, it's the aging population in the north and youth bulge in the south. And if you look at these new projections, that also, in the long run, if you take the long view again, is going to disappear. And that's why I underline the importance of the transition period, because the transition period is going to be as what we are seeing today. So the migration issue also is going to stay, because the migration issue is not because of, as a solution to the problem in the aging population in the north, but the migration as a fact of life, as there is a youth bulge, less investment in the south, it creates a movement of its own that needs to be taken into account at the end of the day. So there is an environmental dimension if you look at those new projections. If the number of human beings that are living on the planet is going to decline, our harmful effect on the planet is also going to decline again in the long run. Regarding that question about G20 consensus, I think Fabrizio asked that question. I think the issues that Katarina has raised, the measurement issues about the well-being, about this, the welfare in the coming period, I think that's a good issue that it's possible to reach a kind of an agreement on much more easily, and then it also requires some kind of an action, because this is a global mega trend and this is a G20 issue at the end of the day. And also I think because of what we are seeing today, these governance or the management of elderly care centers is going to be an important issue that needs to be on the agenda in the coming period. And I think we are, in all this discussion, underestimating the importance of this intergenerational equality issue. It is a very important issue, because gray economy is good. It's good for us to have a longer period of working, but that makes it very difficult for the youngsters to start a new life for themselves. Also at the same time, and because as long as the elderly are around, it's easier for them, like the health, and have-nots discussion, it's easier for them to have access to the banking system too at the same time, and it's going to make it very difficult for the youngsters to buy houses for themselves, to establish families, to start a life for themselves. So it might be useful to think about some kind of support mechanism for the youngsters too, for the youth too, to deal with this issue also. And I don't want to say anything about the women. I mean, there is an issue, a gender issue, but it's a general gender issue. Whether you are old or young, you are going to. I mean, that's an issue that needs to be addressed, of course.
So many thanks. I must say our debate has become increasingly interesting and intriguing, but unfortunately the time is running out. So let me now give the floor to Piercarlo Padoan, our Vice President. Please, Piercarlo, you have the floor for some concluding remarks.
Well, thanks a lot. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for a very interesting discussion and a very rich agenda which has come out of these topics, which certainly warrant the fact that the Italian G20 presidency should devote a lot of attention to the aging issues. So what I'll do in the few seconds I am afraid I have is try to share with you some of the points which to me seem particularly interesting towards building a policy agenda. Well, first of all, I'm just drawing on your remarks, so not adding anything. First of all, it has been repeatedly recognized that the aging society is a multidimensional issue, which adds new pressures which have to be taken into account in an interdependent way. And so there are several policy challenges which need to be listed out and thought about for policymakers to decide what is the appropriate response. Well, first of all, only a few of you actually, to my surprise, mentioned COVID-19. One question which I go back home unanswered with is COVID-18, or 19 rather, going to change dramatically the aging scenario, or is it just going to go by because the aging issues will be much longer? This is a question for which I don't have an answer. What I have in mind is the fact that it's not so much COVID-19 itself that is going to put pressure, but the fact that maybe, according to some views, pandemics are going to be on the rise in the future. So we're going to live in a world where a new megatrend will be more pandemics of whatever 19, 25, or whatever number you may want to list them with, which has implications in terms of policy response. There's going to be increased pressure on some of the areas many of you mentioned. One, of course, is the healthcare sector. We see this very, very much in Europe. We see it elsewhere. We see it in Italy, where we thought, and we may mean many countries, we thought we had a good healthcare system in advanced economies. We suddenly discovered that this is not the case, number one. Number two, pandemics are by definition global. They face no boundaries. So this is by definition an area where we need collective action internationally. We need to build up a long-term strategy towards healthcare. And this, of course, in a way contradicts, and I apologize for pointing that out, contradicts the fact that aging society is bringing longer lives, longer healthy lives, with the caveat that maybe pandemics may change that a little bit. So this is a question that remains unanswered to me. But there is pressure on other areas of the aging society framework. One of which has been mentioned even now, is a pressure on financial investment, and long-term pension reform is something which is facing different difficulties because of the very low interest rate environment, which, according to experts, is not going to go away anytime soon, and it's certainly already putting problems on pension funds to provide resources for the older ones. And so this is another pressure which comes out of the aging society. So after having asked, is the health system sustainable and is the financial system sustainable? I think a key question which has been put on the table has been, is the social system sustainable? And I was really impressed by the attention that was put on the fact that there is sort of a decoupling between social sustainability and economic sustainability. And this needs to be addressed. in a way that brings it back to an intergenerational policy agenda. I'll come back to that in a second. But here, next in my list is a question which, as an economist, I've been looking at for some time, finding no answer. To what extent aging societies impact on long-term productivity growth? If we look at for instance, just to mention an example, the debate over whether advanced economies are entering a secular stagnation era, which means lower and lower long-term growth. To what extent is this response because of aging, and because of aging which is impacting indirectly negatively on productivity? And to what extent, on the other hand, if we consider healthy aging, this productivity impact is less than what we fear about, especially if we couple it with productivity gains possibly coming out of the digital transformation and the technological transformation. So in a nutshell, and maybe a bit roughly, is aging impacting on long-term productivity in one way or the other, or is it impacting at all? I'm about to finish, because then I come to the policy agenda. We're discussing this in a G20 environment, and the Italian presidency is eager to listen to your policy recommendations. I don't have any policy recommendations specifically, but I think that what both Paola and Stefano suggested is very useful. Paola said, let's clearly admit that we need to discuss thoroughly on policy issues related to aging in a structured way. And Stefano set on the table the multi-generational policy agenda as an approach which needs to be taken. I fully agree. We need a very strong approach, and if I may, I think that this should be called a multi-generational policy agenda, but also I would add the term alliance. One of the tremendous policy challenges is that sometimes we think that there is a conflict between young generations and older generations. This approach should be set aside, and we should try to define a policy approach which brings together over an appropriate time horizon the interest of the younger generations, which will eventually get older, and the older generations, which will eventually get out of the scene. So I think this is extremely important, and I hope that the Italian presidency takes that into full consideration. Thanks very much again for a very interesting debate.
So many thanks, Piercarlo. I also think our debate has been very rich and stimulating. I personally found it informative, but also provocative. And so a virtual applause to all our speakers for their really outstanding contributions. Let me just stress that we are going to organize another meeting within the framework of the same project. This time we would like to discuss the problem of circular economy, another subject on which the Italian government has placed the emphasis in the run-up to the presidency. So of course all of you will be invited to join us for this additional meeting, but today's meeting ends here. Thanks a lot, all of you.